Great. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We're going to get started with our press briefing. My name is Brett Maney. I'm the Senior Communications Manager at Unite America. Today, we're going to be talking about our new report called The Primary Problem: How Partisan Primaries Disenfranchise Voters, Distort Representation, and Fuel Political Division. We're really excited to have the 5 speakers with us all today, including Nick Troiano, the Executive Director of the Unite America Institute, Mindy Finn, CEO of Citizen Data, Christian Gross, Associate Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at the University of Southern California, Jason Grenn, the Executive Director of Alaskans for Better Elections, and Sara Eskrich, the Executive Director of Democracy Found in Wisconsin. We'll be pretty quick with our briefing today, about 30 minutes. I'll pass it over to Nick in a second, but a quick note that we will have time for questions at the end if there are any, and you can either type them into the chat below or push the little hand icon to raise your hand at the end. And with that, I will pass it over to Nick Troiano, Executive Director of the Unite America Institute.
Thank you, Brett. Thanks for everyone who's joining us today. As Brett said, my name is Nick Troiano. I run Unite America and the Unite America Institute, which is excited to release our new report today called The Primary Problem. Our report breaks some new ground with data from the 2020 election that finds that despite record turnout in the general election, only 10% of voters in America effectively decided a supermajority of our congressional elections, over about 80%. This is a pretty remarkable data point, which helps tell a much larger story about the pernicious role that partisan primaries are playing in our politics today. So I'm excited to dive in to share some of the top line findings of our report and why it matters in our politics. So I'll begin by describing what we mean by the primary problem, which is, as our report describes, the fact that only a small minority of often extreme voters decide the vast majority of our elections, fueling polarization and preventing problem solving. If we were to take a step back, we can see how the primary problem can help explain a few important trends in our politics. The first is the role that partisan primaries play in the polarization of Congress. What you're looking at is a representation of members of Congress based on their ideology and voting records. It used to be the case that there was broad overlap between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat. That has evaporated by 2011. There was no more ideological overlap between the two parties in Congress. The second trend the primary problem contributes to is a lack of bipartisan policymaking in our politics. It used to be the case that big change came with big majorities of both parties, from civil rights to welfare reform. But of late, either nothing gets done or one party jams its agenda through on partisan votes, as we saw most recently with the American Rescue Plan. And finally, the primary problem can help explain the persisting gap between members of Congress approval rating and their reelection rate. So in the last Congress, we saw the average approval rating be below 20%, but over 90% got reelected. This is the gap between what it takes to govern and what it takes to get reelected. So of course, there are many problems that contribute to these disturbing trends. Partisan primaries aren't the only one, but we argue in our report that they're the primary one, and importantly, one that we have an ability to solve, as some states already have, which we'll hear about today. So what is driving the primary problem? 3 things. First, 83% of our congressional districts are considered safe for one party or the other. The number of truly competitive districts have rapidly declined over the past couple decades, as you can see here. Some of that is due to gerrymandering, but most of it is due to the electorate's own partisan self-sorting and the divide between urban and rural voters. That means in these safe districts, the vast majority of them, the general election is over before it even happens, because these elections are decided in the primaries, and specifically in the primary of the dominant party. Second, very few voters participate in primary elections. In congressional midterms, it's usually under 20%, sometimes even below 15%, as you can see here. In many cases, that's by design. Over half of the states restrict participation in primaries based on one's party affiliation or lack of, depicted here in light gray and light blue. Among these restrictions blocks 11 million independent voters in 10 states from participating. And in other states, if you're a Democrat in a Republican district or a Republican in the Democrat district, you may be prohibited from voting in the primary that actually matters. These voters, millions of them, are effectively disenfranchised. And third, the third driver of our primary problem is that those who do participate in primary elections are unrepresentative of the general election electorate, even among those in the same party. They tend to be a lot more partisan and a lot more ideologically extreme than general election voters. What you're looking at here is findings from the Brookings Institute, which show that primary voters tend to be heavily skewed towards strong partisans. My colleague Mindy Finn from Citizen Data will dive deeper on this topic in a few minutes based on a case study that we conducted in Colorado's 3rd district. So if you put that all together, lopsided and safe districts, restrictive and low turnout elections, and unrepresentative and extreme participation, you get the primary problem. And our report looks at just how pronounced this problem is, and for the first time, analyzes turnout in all 435 congressional districts to find just how many voters are actually having a ballot that matters. And what we found was that number is less than 10% of voters deciding over 80% of our congressional elections. This is in part because in 151 congressional districts, so over a third of Congress, not only did the dominant party primary determine the outcome, there was zero competition against the incumbent in that primary. So effectively 0 voters had any say in electing their representative. And in the other 161 safe districts that did have competition, the turnout in the primary that mattered was under 17%. This primary problem leads candidates to only represent those who vote in the primary and leads elected officials to govern in a way that only panders to the base of their party, rather than, of course, solving problems in the public interest. This lesson was reinforced in 2020, the lesson about having to fear a primary challenger. 8 incumbents lost primaries, 5 of them lost to more extreme challengers. A couple had ethical or legal issues, and just one, notably Steve King, was perhaps the only example of someone losing a primary for being too extreme. And that's really saying something. So the lesson to any lawmaker who's paying attention is quite simple. If you represent a safe district, the only way that you'll get tossed out of office likely is if you fall out of line with your party's base. What we also saw in many open seat contests where there was no incumbent was that more progressive or more conservative candidates would prevail, oftentimes without even getting a majority of the vote in multi-candidate races. An example that you can see here is Marjorie Taylor Greene. She won with just 40% of the vote in an open seat, with support from just 9% of total eligible voters in her district. So in sum, and to sort of bring it back to where we started, this is how partisan primaries are driving our politics to the extreme. This is how partisan primaries prevent bipartisan compromise on policymaking. And this is how partisan primaries are what insulates Congress from electoral accountability while not producing results for the American people. As our report details, and here's the good news, there's a solution, and they're called nonpartisan primaries. Nonpartisan primaries allow all candidates to run and all voters to participate in a single election. The top finishers advance to the general election, where whoever earns a majority of support wins. What that means is that every voter can cast a ballot that matters, not just 10%. It also means that candidates are incentivized to campaign to their entire electorate based on their ideas, not just to their base based on their party affiliation. And it means that elected officials can be liberated from the threat of being primaried by their own party's base and to be held accountable by all their voters. 2 states currently use nonpartisan primaries for federal elections. That's Washington and California. In these states in 2020, we saw nonpartisan primaries with both more competition and more participation compared to states with partisan primaries. As Professor Gross here will talk about shortly, his study found that members of Congress who were elected in nonpartisan primaries were 18 percentage points less extreme than those elected from closed primaries. In 2020, Alaska became the 3rd state to adopt nonpartisan primaries at the ballot for federal elections, which Jason Grenn will describe in some more depth soon. Unlike California and Washington, instead of just sending the top 2 vote finishers to the general election, Alaska will send the top 4. And in the general election, voters will have the ability to rank their candidates using an instant runoff process, and whoever earns majority support will win. Known as Final Four voting, this system will be implemented in 2022, notably when Senator Lisa Murkowski is up for election. And that's important because, of course, former President Trump previously vowed to primary Senator Murkowski for her vote in his impeachment trial. And many observers have since noted how Alaska's electoral reform will make that much harder, if not impossible, to do so. A Final Four or even Final Five system has several advantages over top two, as we describe in our report. As Catherine Gale and Michael Porter wrote in their seminal Harvard Business School report in 2017, a Final Five voting system has the dual advantage of not only more competition, but also the ability to level the playing field for third-party and independent candidates. So that's why we're excited to see this reform spread to even more states beyond Alaska, most recently to Wisconsin, where a bipartisan bill for Final Five voting was introduced just last week, as we'll hear from Sara Eskrich shortly. So in closing, in releasing this report today, Unite America hopes to stimulate a greater conversation and hopefully more action around the primary problem based on the simple idea that how we elect is as important, if not more so, than who we elect, because incentives matter. The current incentives in our electoral system are broken, and it's on all of us to fix them. Last thing I'll note is just a big thanks to the Unite America team for their hard work in producing this report over the past few months, and a special thanks to its co-authors, both Tyler Fisher and Beth Laddick. Back to you, Brett.
Thank you, Nick. Now we're going to hear from Mindy Finn, the Chief Executive Officer of Citizen Data, who conducted the polling in Colorado 3 that's cited in the report.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you, Nick and Unite America. It's great to be with you all today. So on behalf of Unite America Institute, Citizen Data polled and analyzed Colorado's 3rd Congressional District. This is the congressional district currently represented by Republican Representative Lauren Boebert. We specifically examined polarization and the role of the primary in determining the congressional winner. And as Brett mentioned, there's a case study on this district featured in the report. Among other key findings in our research, we observed much greater ideological extremism and partisanship among GOP primary voters than the full electorate across a range of measures. Moreover, in line with the national average, something to know about Colorado 3 is only about 10% of eligible voters in the district cast a ballot for Boebert in the primary. To inform our research, Citizen Data conducted independent post-election surveys from November 4th to November 9th of 2020 of representative and weighted samples of Congressional District 3 general election and Republican primary voters, 750 respondents from each from the 2020 elections, with a margin of error of 2.5 percentage points for the general election sample and 3.6 percentage points for the primary. We focused on Colorado 3 as a key case study for in-depth research because the district can be viewed as a microcosm of a politically and demographically diverse, yet closely divided nation. Colorado 3 is also one of only 8 districts in which an incumbent member of Congress lost their 2020 primary. Competitive congressional districts have become increasingly rare over time, as Nick mentioned, and Colorado 3 exemplifies that trend. Though it had remained relatively competitive until about 2010, it was represented by a Democrat until then, who was defeated by the most recent incumbent, Republican Scott Tipton. In contrast with Boebert, Tipton, who served 5 terms, was largely known in Congress to be a fiscal conservative who kept his head down and middle-of-the-road Republican. So turning to the Colorado 3 survey data, go to the next slide. Across a variety of measures, we observe consistent evidence suggesting much greater ideological extremism and partisanship among GOP primary voters than the general election. To start, utilizing responses from our survey to policy preference questions, we constructed an additive index summarizing respondents' ideology and visualized the ideological divides in Colorado 3's primary and general electorates in this violin plot. The issue areas that we tested were tax policy, immigration, gun control, and police reform, and these were chosen to reflect highly salient policy disagreements during the 2020 primary campaign season in Colorado 3 and nationwide. Respondents were coded on the direction and intensity of their agreement with left-leaning or right-leaning policy statements, placed on a common scale and averaged across the number of statements to which they responded. From this, we generated a 1 to 5 ideological policy preference scale, with 1 indicating the most left-leaning and 5 indicating the most right-leaning. So if you look at the violin plot that we are displaying currently, the width of each plot at any point on the x-axis corresponds to the number of respondents with scores at that level. So the greater the width of the plot at a given score, the larger the share of respondents with that score. So starting with the bottom plot that you're viewing, which is all general election voters in Colorado 3, their mean ideology score as measured by this scale is 3.4, which is somewhat to the right of the mean value 3, but pretty close. And that's in line with kind of the expected current lean Republican R+6 ranking of the district. By contrast, the Colorado 3 Republican primary voters plotted at the top lean substantially rightwards by this measure, with a mean value of 4.4. So 3.4 for all general election voters, 4.4 out of a 5 scale for Republican primary voters. Finally, in the middle, you see Republican registrants who voted only in the general electorate, falling somewhere in between with a mean value of 3.9. So these are Republicans who voted only in the general election, not the primary. And their mean policy preference ideology score was 3.9 compared to all Republican primary voters, where it was 4.4. Similarly, Republican primary voters in Colorado 3 rated themselves, and you can go to the next slide, as considerably more ideologically conservative than did the overall general election electorate. In particular, and you can see this graphed here, 60% of Republican primary voters rated themselves as very conservative on a 5-point scale, compared to 35% of Republicans who only voted in the general, and 25% of voters overall. We also used, I'll note, a feeling thermometer scale for which GOP primary voters were much more likely than general election voters to give Democrats very cold, unfavorable ratings on a scale of 0 to 100. The mean rating for Republican primary voters was 11 in how cold they felt towards Democrats, versus 45 for general election voters. And more likely, they were also obviously more likely to give Republicans very warm, favorable ratings. Finally, Republican primary voters are nearly twice as likely as general election voters to favor uncompromising leaders over those who debate compromise. Go to the next slide.
And Mindy, your mic is making some noise too.
Okay. So on the final slide, you can see that Republican primary voters appear to inhabit a different information ecosystem than general election voters. When asked for their primary source of news, nearly 3 in 5 Republican primary voters in Colorado 3, 58%, reported tuning into Fox News most frequently. In contrast, among general election voters in Colorado 3, only 1 in 4, 24%, said that they tune in most frequently to Fox News, which really seems to underscore that those who vote in the primary, which again, those who elected Boebert was only 10% of all eligible voters, really occupy not only a different ideological set of preferences, but also information ecosystem. Though this research was conducted in a single congressional district, which is not necessarily representative of all congressional districts, it nonetheless sheds light on connections between voter level political polarization and the political polarization that has been observed in Congress and increasingly state and local governments. Turn it back to you, Brett.
Thank you, Mindy. Next, we will be hearing from Christian Gross, Associate Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at the University of Southern California. He is the Academic Director of the USC Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy, and he directs USC's Fair Maps and Political Reform Lab, which works to generate new ideas to reform American democracy. Christian.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that I've done on primary systems and how that's affects legislators' ideology. And so this is referenced in the report, The Primary Problem. I published an article called Reducing Legislative Polarization, Top 2 and Open Primaries are Associated with More Moderate Legislators in the peer-reviewed journal of Political Institutions and Political Economy. And I'm going to summarize that research. And I'm also going to summarize a little bit of research about the California State Legislature, looking at when California went from its former system to its new system with a nonpartisan primary, especially with a focus on the general election. I'm thinking about competition in the general election, which is what Nick and Mindy have talked about already. So just to give a sort of a top line, what do I find in my research? I look at all members of Congress from 2003 to 2018. I look at how they're elected and what kind of primaries they're elected in. Are they elected in closed primaries, where it's a DNR primary and only DNR voters can vote in the first round? Are they elected in open primaries, or are they elected in the top two nonpartisan system? And what I find is in the nonpartisan top two system used in places like California and Washington at the national level to elect members of Congress, those members are less extreme ideologically than those who are elected in closed primaries and other systems. And the main takeaway is that 18 percentage points more moderate is what we find with legislators who are in top two nonpartisan systems compared to closed primary systems among new members of Congress. So there's two parts to the story. Changing the electoral system to have a nonpartisan top two primary led to moderation, but also electing new people in that system is what led to more moderation. So first you have to change the electoral system, and then you end up having new members who have different incentives under that electoral system. What I argue in the paper and what I find is that this nonpartisan system is important not just because of the primary, right? So Nick talked about closed primaries a bit. The closed primary system basically creates a D or an R who wins in most parts of the country, right? Like, so in Los Angeles, where I live, most of the districts lean Democratic or lopsidedly Democratic. So whoever would have won a Democratic primary and runs against a Republican, the Democrat is likely to win because voters who are mostly Democrats here are going to vote for the Democrat. But now what ends up happening under the nonpartisan system is the general election will, frequently about 25% of the time have two Democrats running against each other. And then similarly, in the rural parts of the state, out in the desert, you've got two Republicans who run against each other in the general election. And so no longer can voters in the general just look and see, is there a D or is there an R, right? They have to actually evaluate the candidate. So if there's two Ds on the ballot, they have to look and say, well, who do I agree with on policy? Who is the most competent? What are the other sort of evaluative criteria that you will make a decision on as a voter? And so what does that do for elected members of Congress? It creates an incentive for them not to necessarily become like super moderate, because it's still, Los Angeles or rural California, but they become more moderate, right? They're more moderate than they would have been under a system where they don't have to worry about the general election. And so the threat of same party competition in the general election drives the members of Congress to be less extreme in the data that I look at. And what's really interesting is, it's about 17% of members of Congress presently are elected under this system. When adding in Alaska, we'll add some more data, but the lopsided districts is where this is happening, right? It's the lopsided D or the lopsided R districts where general election competition creates more choice, and voters have to really think about how they're making those choices. I also looked at California when California changed its system in 2012 to go from its former system to the nonpartisan top two system. And at that point, immediately after the change, the Assembly and the Senate saw a reduction in partisan polarization. The California Assembly had a 15% drop in polarization following the adoption of the nonpartisan top two primary. That's in a report that I wrote called The Adoption of the Top Two Primary System from several years ago. That's at the USC Schwarzenegger Institute website if people are interested in reading that. The Journal of Political Institutions and Political Economy article that I referenced looking at members of Congress is also available at our website at the Schwarzenegger Institute. The takeaway that I want people to be left with is that a lot of times when, as scholars or as practitioners, we focus on primaries, we only look at the first part of the election. But the second part of the election, the general election in November, is so important, right? So in a closed primary, where there's basically effectively no competition in a lot of congressional districts or state legislative districts, the decision is done in the first stage. But in these nonpartisan systems, like the top two in California and Washington, the competition in the general election, or even the threat of competition in the general election, really could lead to ideological moderation among members of Congress, especially new legislators that get elected under the system. And so if we think about this to conclude, in the case of Wisconsin, which is considering this proposal, Wisconsin is one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. It's one of the worst partisan gerrymanders. It went to the Supreme Court to try to end the partisan gerrymandering, but that didn't work. But what's another way around that? Well, imagine a district that's lopsidedly Republican. It would probably have 2 Republicans running against each other, or 4 Republicans, or maybe 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat in a system where there's more than 2 people in the general. But the general election might face same party competition, which would actually then create interesting choices where voters can't just pick based on the D or the R on the label. And so I do think the Wisconsin case is really interesting, given the extensive partisan gerrymandering and the number of lopsided districts that exist in that state. And thanks. I'm going to pass it back over to Brett.
Thank you so much. Before we get to Wisconsin, we're going to go to Jason Grenn, the Executive Director of Alaskans for Better Elections, the organization that led the campaign for top 4 nonpartisan primaries in Alaska. And as you heard from Nick, Alaska did become the first state to adopt the powerful combination of nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting. And Jason and his team are currently working across the state to implement it. Jason is also a former state legislator with his own experience with the primary problem. Jason.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. As Brett mentioned, my name is Jason Grenn. I'm the Executive Director with Alaskans for Better Elections. And as a lifelong Alaskan and former independent lawmaker in our state, very excited to talk about the reforms that are happening and the momentum that we hope is happening around the country thanks to our success with ballot measure 2. If you know anything about Alaska, Alaskans like to do things differently. We often say we don't care how people do it outside, we're going to do it our own way. And that actually works well in our politics. We elect independent governors, we elect independent lawmakers throughout the state, and we've elected an independent U.S. Senator through a write-in process, Senator Lisa Murkowski in 2010. And so I think we show as Alaskans, we tend to want to elect leaders, regardless of their party affiliation. We get to know our candidates, and we want to elect people who are willing to get past partisan politics, work towards solutions. And so that works really well. Again, with our politics, over 60% of the voters in Alaska are registered as nonpartisan, independent voters. It's the highest in the nation. And that really reflects who we are as a people in our state. But that's actually a problem when we have closed primaries. You can imagine being an independent like myself, or even a Democrat, Republican. You show up at your primary and you want to vote for a Republican governor, but a Democrat state representative. You couldn't do that in our previous system. And Alaskans got a firsthand look of the problem of the closed primary system in August of 2020. At the same time, we were campaigning, trying to open up primaries, trying to install ranked choice voting and expose dark money in our state politics. The primary in August of 2020 saw 5 different sitting legislators get ousted in their primary. And these were colleagues of mine, people who I knew to be hardworking legislators, people who reflected their district, people who were willing to work across the aisle to help fight some of the problems that we're facing in Alaska. But as has been mentioned several times, the primaries were weaponized. And the problem with that is we saw, like I mentioned, many sitting legislators who were very effective in representing their districts well get ousted by a very low number of voters and get installed new, very extreme right and left sitting legislators who are not willing to help reach across the aisle and work towards solutions, but really just kind of toe the party line. And I think that happening in the primary really opened the eyes to a lot of Alaskan voters and said, we need change. And so that really helped our campaign, talking about open primaries, talking about ranked choice voting. And ballot measure 2 passed, very small margin, but it did pass with bipartisan support. In the same election that Donald Trump won our state by 10%, we saw our U.S. Senator and U.S. Representative, both Republicans, get reelected. A ballot reform like this passed with over 50% because many people saw the need for change. And Alaskans decided that, again, like we're going to do it like no one else in the country does. We're going to try to do something different. And ballot measure 2 helped many reforms, but really open primaries, I think, was the most exciting part because it's going to allow our voters to be Alaskans when they vote. Every Alaskan is going to get the same ballot, and we're going to vote as one, not as a division of people. And I think that's going to get new people, new candidates excited. It's going to force candidates to talk to everyone, not just their base, but everyone in their neighborhood. And we're really excited to be, the first in the nation who's going to be installing open primaries and ranked choice voting in 2022. And as previously mentioned, you've seen some of the effects of that already when it comes to our national politics. But from our state politics and local elections, there's a lot of great momentum and people figuring out how that's going to work for the people. Because really, again, as the reason this campaign was so exciting was that it puts more choice and more power to the voters, which is where it needs to be. And again, very exciting to be leading this sort of reform and the great outcomes that are going to come locally and hopefully nationally as well.
Thank you, Jason. All right, finally, we have Sara Eskrich. She is the Senior Advisor to the Institute for Public Innovation and serves as the Executive Director for Democracy Found, currently advocating for voters' first policies in Wisconsin. Just earlier this month, bipartisan legislation was introduced in Wisconsin's legislature that would implement Final Five voting for congressional elections, which is very exciting. Sara.
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, I'm here to tell you about the next steps for how we deal with this primary problem at the state level. And top line, I think the outlook is really, really good. So as Brett mentioned, has been discussed a couple times on the call already, just last week in Wisconsin, bipartisan co-authors introduced legislation in our state for Final Five voting with over 20 bipartisan co-sponsors. So this work is over 2 years in the making. It's supported by the organization that I run, Democracy Found, that was co-founded by Wisconsin business leaders Catherine Gale and Austin Ramirez a couple of years ago. Like the campaign in Alaska, our campaign in Wisconsin is based on Catherine Gale's origination of politics industry theory and the realization that Final Five voting is both powerful and achievable as a solution for these root cause problems that we're seeing that are resulting in partisan gridlock and stagnation in Washington, D.C. Importantly to note also, Catherine is a Unite America board member. So at the state level, I'll report to you, similar to what Jason said, the voters and legislators instinctively understand this primary problem. I think that's one of the key reasons that our new constituency has come together to work on this political innovation at the state level. And it's consisted of this phenomenal group of cross-partisan business and community leaders. People that don't traditionally work together have come together to support Final Five voting in our state. One quick example of that for you. When our organization launched back in 2018, we had a big event where one of the most largest funder of progressive causes in the state of Wisconsin, as well as the only individual in the state of Wisconsin in 2016 to hold a fundraiser in his home for then candidate Donald Trump, came together on stage. Now, these two individuals don't agree on politicians, they don't agree on policy, but they said that they do agree that our political system, the incentives in our electoral system in particular, need to work. They need to drive problem solving, not the gridlock that we're currently seeing. So that consensus, that understanding of the electoral incentives, it's also known by legislators. It's also why we have the bipartisan support in our state legislature for Final Five voting, when so much of the dialogue these days about election reform, and legislation related to elections is partisan, both in Wisconsin and across the country. That's not the case in Wisconsin because, as our co-founder Catherine Gale often says, Final Five voting is not intended to change who gets elected. It might do that, but it's intended to change the underlying incentives for what elected officials do while governing. So many people have articulated the importance of that shift from the primary election being the most important to the general election being the most important. The Unite America report really outlines that problem so well. So what's next at the state level? Well, in Wisconsin, we're going to continue to build bipartisan support for our legislation, both in our state legislature and in the wider community of voters and leaders throughout our state. I'll tell you anecdotally, the interest and demand is very high, in part because it's so empowering to work on something systemic that we can all agree on and doesn't just fall on our traditional party lines. And nationally, the Institute for Political Innovation that Catherine Gale founded after she released her book, The Politics Industry, back in 2020. She started this institute really as both a home for theory and scholarship, but even more importantly, as a place to continue supporting state activity and campaigns, like what we saw in Alaska, like what we're doing in Wisconsin. And similarly, IPI is getting incredible bipartisan and impressive interest from state leaders who want to do what Alaska did at the ballot. And about half the states have the ability to change the way their party primaries are run at the ballot box. So we're really excited. We expect several ballot initiative campaigns for Final Five voting in even the 2022 election cycle. So I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have about the work of Democracy Found in Wisconsin or about the Institute for Political Innovation nationally. Thanks so much for spreading the word about this powerful problem diagnosis, and most importantly, to Unite America for coming together to work with us on the most powerful solution of Final Five voting at the state level.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And as Sarah noted, we can open up to questions now. If anyone has one, once again, you can put it in the chat or you can raise your hand, which is the little icon on the bar below. Bridget, I'm going to unmute you real quick. Okay, you're unmuted.
Thank you. I just had a quick question, follow-up question, Sarah, to something that you mentioned. You mentioned you're expecting ballot initiatives in other states. Can you give us any sense of what other states you'll be watching, like where this could come up in 2022?
Sure, it's a little early for me to start dropping state names, unfortunately, but I do think you'll see a handful of states, both traditionally red states and traditionally blue states and purple states. But like I mentioned, about half of the states have the ability to move change to electoral systems at the ballot box through initiative like Alaska did. And about half the states are going to require a legislative campaign like the one we're running in Wisconsin to do this legislatively. So you'll continue to see action, I believe, on both of those fronts in various states.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions? Gonna hold for one more second. All right, thank you all so much for joining. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to email me and I can connect you with whoever. My email is Brett, B-R-E-T-T, @uniteamerica.org. You all should have a full copy of the briefing in your inboxes shortly, if not already, with the relevant links to the report, as well as a 3-minute video that we produced that explains the primary problem thesis. Thank you so much. And once again, feel free to follow up. Thank you to our panelists as well. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you.